All right, welcome back. And in this lecture, we're going to focus more on the abnormal behaviors. Now, if you just look at the strict definition of what an abnormal behavior is, you can see it there. It's this behavior that they repeat often, and it really doesn't have a function, doesn't have a specific purpose. So like when a horse, reaches down and eats, obviously it's doing that for nutrients and to keep their bodies going. If during social behavior they nip at somebody or turn to kick, that's normal because that's their threat response. They're responding to some sort of stimulus that they don't like. So these abnormal behaviors are what we call stereotypic behaviors, and they're a result of a lot of stress. And I know I've said this in the previous lectures. This is where they start to manifest. It's either a bored animal or an animal that's under a lot of stress. And we see this quite a bit with our zoo animals because these are captive wild animals and they're kept in small spaces. So they start to manifest these stereotypic behaviors. And the zoo industry really studies these really hard to see how they can alleviate that stress and boredom. So this elephant's doing what's called weaving, and we'll see this again in this lecture. Now, it's always good to make sure you have a good foundation in what normal behavior is. And, even looking at these time budgets, some of these abnormal behaviors will actually fall into some of these categories. So, the weaving, it's not quite locomote, but it's not quite inactive. So, what kind of behavior is that? I don't know. But some of these other behaviors we'll talk about, ingestive behaviors, would obviously fall into the feed forage normal time budgets. Now, where time budgets do come into play is if an animal spends a really long time. If you saw this inactivity go way up, then that to me would indicate a health problem or something like that. So it's good to have a review of what's normal. And again, these animals learn a lot, or they display a lot of their behaviors that are very similar to their wild counterparts. So out in the wild, their innate natural behaviors is something that we can always reference back to our captive population to kind of measure what's normal. Now, do we see abnormal behavior in wild equids? And in nature, most often not, because it would result in predation. If they're abnormal from the herd, that's what predators are looking for. They're looking for abnormalities, and those are the animals that they try to pick off, as nature runs its course. So we don't really see these exotics or free-ranging horses, so horses that are released, in the wild or kept on large pastures. We tend not to see these abnormal behaviors manifest in themselves. But I will say, when you do put them in captive situations, so like especially during these, this is a wild horse roundup, we tend to see these abnormal behaviors at a greater frequency than we do in our domestic horses and donkeys. So, what's the incidence of that? And it runs anywhere from 5 to 25%, depending on the studies you look at. So, that's pretty low at 5%. That's pretty high at 25%. So it's probably somewhere in the middle, across horses around the world. And again, it's just a response to this stress, this boredom, and these start to manifest themselves, these abnormal behaviors. Now, the most common type of abnormal behavior is actually locomotion. And again, these are things you can, if you go to the zoo and you kind of pay attention to see if you're looking for it, you'll probably notice some of these animals doing that. And the first one we talk about is walking the perimeter. And this is generally in a paddock type situation where a horse just keeps walking the perimeter, in that square, almost like in a circle, and just keeps walking and walking. It repeats the pattern over and over and over. And again, it's an abnormal, boredom, trying to alleviate boredom, not knowing what to do, and they walk in a pattern. Now, this weaving is what we've already seen with the elephant, and you see this in horses, and I've seen this actually on the racetrack when I was working there, and you would notice these race horses, in these stalls, and they would just go back and forth, and that's weaving. They have so much energy, and then they're in these confined spaces that it's just they don't know what to do with it, so they start to manifest some of these things. Now, pacing, almost like walking the perimeter. So, you'll see, an animal go up and down the fence and up and down the fence and up and down the fence, and they just keep doing this pattern over and over and over. Again, repetition. is where we see this. So, after the locomotion ones, the next one that's probably the most, I guess, popular or most well known is what's called cribbing. And this is where horses will actually rest their front incisors on something hard, and generally it's a fence post or a fence, something hard, and then they arch their neck, they gulp in air, and then they expel it, okay? And they keep repeating this behavior, and they'll go and put their feet, their teeth on those fence posts. And we think this manifests itself because they get a little bit of a natural high with this. The brain releases some endorphins, so some natural, feel-good hormones, and the horse will feel good about it. And so they actually, it's believed, they really start to become addicted to this, and they get some of this kind of an addiction to cribbing. And so they'll repeat this behavior over and over and over, and it's really, really harmful to their health. And the first major problem is they start to wear down their incisors. And if anybody's ever had a cribbing horse, and I've seen this personally with a cribbing horse, they wear down those front teeth. And the problem is if they're out on pasture somewhere, they're going to have a hard time nibbling grass, the forage they're trying to get at. And so they'll have a really, really difficult time trying to get mouthfuls of forage. So again, that's very, very detrimental to their health. And then things that start to pop up, like ulcers. Now, ulcers come with stress. So this animal, obviously, if they develop this cribbing, they're under some sort of stress. Then you have them cribbing, and this unnatural, ingestion, again, leads to problems in the stomach. And you can see in those images, what a healthy stomach lining of a horse looks like, and then the ulcers, which again is a painful condition for them. And then the other thing is it can lead to colic, which next week we'll talk more about colic. And really it's a major problem in confined equids and can often lead to death. So it's something that we'll definitely address next week when we talk about nutrition. So again, another problem with cribbing horses. Now the next type of abnormal behavior is self-mutilation or over-grooming, and we see this with all different types of species that they'll just pick an area and then just bite and nibble and groom themselves until they get down to all the hair's gone, and then they'll start rubbing away the skin, and then they'll get some sores there, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. We see this with dogs too. So, or a horse that kicks quite a bit in their stalls or paddocks because of that boredom, and that can injure them. So that's again something to be aware of that can result from this. And then there's just some others that we're not going to have time to go into each one, but pawing, you typically see that a lot with horses that are tied up, especially if they're tied up for too long. Things like wood chewing on the fences, which can be really destructive. And again, that wood isn't very nutritious for them, so again can cause some digestive problems. Tail rubbing, which you see in this image here, they'll rub away some of those hairs on the top of the tail, and that would be kind of important when we get to parasites, because pinworms can actually cause an irritated hiney, and so they'll rub their rears quite a bit and rub off some of that hair. And then head nodding. So some of these others can be indicative of health problems, as we'll see, especially with the ingestive problems, and jump right into the over drinking. You want to monitor your animal's water intake. And again, next week we'll jump into more nutrition and water intake, but you want to know how much they're drinking per day. Because when they start to overdrink, that can really be indications of some serious health problems. One is Cushing's disease, and others like renal failure. So if a horse really starts going from the average 10 to 15 gallons of water per day up to 25, 30, then that could be indicative of a health problem. And then wind sucking, you'll hear this term used too. It's like cribbing, but they're not resting their incisors on something. They'll just sit there and stand and do the inhaling and exhaling on there. So that is, again, a learned behavior. Things like eating feces for adult horses is abnormal, and typically it's because there's something lacking in their diet or nutritional deficiency, or they're starving. you'll notice they'll start to eat their feces. Now, I will say in foals, it is normal for them to eat some feces because we believe that helps them establish their good gut bacteria that they're going to need to digest forage in their lifetime. So that's kind of a normal behavior for youngsters. It's the adults when they do this that is definitely abnormal. And then eating dirt. Again, not something normally you want your equids to do. It could be indicative of a mineral deficiency in their diet, so you want to make sure you do monitor their diet. And again, that can lead to colic, especially here in Florida and some of these other places on the globe that have these really sandy soils. And if these horses are getting quite a bit of sand in their gut, they get a thing called sand colic. So that's a danger when you have horses doing this. Now, okay, so those aren't fun. Those aren't great things you want to see with your animals, but there are ways that you can try to either limit or abolish or get rid of these bad behaviors. And the first thing is you got to find out what's stressing them out. And typically these are animals that are confined in stalls or confined in paddocks, and that's why you're going to hear me, and I think I'm going to say it every week almost in every other lecture. These horses need to be turned out daily. They need exercise, they need fresh air, they need to act like a horse, they need to roll in the grass, and they need that for at least 1 hour per day, if not more, if you can provide it for them. That is going to go a long way in helping their mental health, so you don't start to see some of these abnormal behaviors. Now, other things that are kind of catching on in the horse industry, at least here in the United States, is trying to introduce novel objects to horses, and they call this enrichment. And again, zoos have been kind of the leaders in this field in trying to eliminate some of these abnormal behaviors in these captive wild populations. So enrichment's a big part of that, where daily they're introducing new things to keep the animals engaged and not bored or stressed out. So that's starting to carry over in the horse industry, and things like putting novel objects in their pens that they kind of whoa, and then they kind of explore and play with it and have fun with it. That's always a good way to do it. Another thing that I'm seeing some research now on is putting hay in hay bags, and depending on the diameter of the wire or how tight that wire is, it takes a while for that horse to get at that forage and pull it out and eat it, and it's keeping them engaged, and it's going to slow them down at mealtime. So, I know I've already said it in a previous couple lectures on the typical normal behaviors, but we'll get to it, especially with the nutrition behaviors. Small meals all day, so if you do something like this, it's going to drag out that forage time to where they're not getting it all at once. So that's another great idea that's starting to catch on with horse owners. Now, the other thing you have to do is evaluate their social environment. And it's been said a solitary horse is in poor company, because these are very social animals, and their desire is to be around other types of equids, I guess. It doesn't necessarily have to be a horse with a horse or a donkey with a donkey. A lot of times we see horses and minis and donkeys together, and you can even put zebras in with horses and they become buddies, and you can even put goats in with horses and they become buddies. So they're social animals, and they tend to want to be around other animals. Now, I will say this with intact males, so stallions and jacks, generally it's okay that they're by themselves, because in the wild they generally lead a solitary existence, and so they're out and about by themselves, and they generally are okay. The other thing that I would say with social environment is look at the herd structure. A lot of times these lower, less dominant animals get picked on quite a bit, which leads to stress. And then some of these may start to manifest themselves. So you may have to look at separating animals sometimes if you have more than 2 or 3 horses, and look at the social structure makeup of that herd and see if that's contributing to the stress. Now, we're going to definitely jump into this next week, especially how much energy should be in the diet. But diet's high in energy, so if you're feeding a lot of protein and a lot of concentrate and a lot of grain, this horse gets really, it's almost like a 3-year-old with a sugar high, and they get kind of crazy, and they have nowhere to go in stalls or small paddocks. So high energy diets start to have these animals tend to manifest these abnormal behaviors. So if you do, you want to make sure you're feeding the proper plane of nutrition, which next week we'll go into with that. And then kind of your final strategy would be, restraining the animal in some way or, limiting their environment. And this horse has what's called a cribbing collar, which makes that when they do crib extremely uncomfortable for them. So trying to, reduce or eliminate that behavior. Now, I will say I've seen a terrible cribber wearing a crib collar still cribbing. So it's not always 100%, but it is one of those strategies that has proven effective in some animals that will reduce that cribbing behavior. Okay, so in our next lecture, we're going to start going into some of the basic learning, basic psychology and training, how these animals learn. So I'll see you then.